Welcome to the deep dive. Forget just how long you spent hitting the books. Today, we're diving into something way more insightful, how exactly we learn and remember what we read. Because, as it turns out, simply putting in more hours isn't the magic bullet.
Not at all.
We're about to unpack a truly fascinating idea, material-appropriate processing.
That's right. And to really get our heads around this, we're looking at a super interesting study from, way back in 1989. These researchers, McDaniel and Einstein, they asked a really smart question. Why is it that some study methods feel like they, unlock a subject for us?
Yeah.
While others, even ones that seem like they should work, just leave us scratching our heads?
Exactly. And for you, our listener, the mission on this deep dive is crystal clear.
Yeah.
To understand how the very nature of what you're trying to learn, whether it's a gripping story, a dense report, or even like a set of instructions, how that interacts with how you choose to study it. Ultimately, we want to help you learn more effectively and, crucially, ditch those study techniques that are just, well, a waste of your valuable time and energy. Because here's a key insight. The kind of mental work you're doing is way more important than just the amount of time you log.
And this research really throws a curveball at that simple idea that, more effort equals better results.
Totally.
The paper highlights a really persistent puzzle. Those study techniques that everyone says are effective can be surprisingly hit or miss depending on what you're actually studying. Think about it, note-taking. Those little quizzes sometimes tucked into the text.
Embedded questions, yeah.
Right, even making the words harder to read. Sometimes they help. Sometimes they don't seem to make a blind bit of difference.
Okay, let's unpack this head-scratcher. It almost feels wrong, doesn't it? You'd think that anything that makes your brain work harder to understand something would automatically help you remember it better.
Intuitively, yes.
But this paper suggests that's not always the case. So, what's the core idea that McDaniel and Einstein came up with to make sense of these inconsistencies?
Well, their main argument is this idea of material-appropriate processing. Basically, it means that whether a study strategy works well or not really boils down to whether it gets you thinking in a way that fits with how the material itself is structured and presented.
Fits, okay.
It's about finding the right mental approach for the job,
Interesting. So, according to this idea, what are the two main ways our brains process information when we're trying to remember something?
The framework points to two key types of what they called conceptual elaboration, which basically means thinking deeply about the information that are really important for being able to recall things later. Individual item processing and relational processing.
Yeah, individual item processing. Okay, let's dive into that first. What exactly does that involve for you, the learner?
Individual item processing is all about really focusing on the specific details and the meaning of each individual piece of information. It's like taking a magnifying glass to each element and making sure you really understand what it is on its own.
Got it. So you're really concentrating on understanding each point in isolation.
Pretty much.
And what about relational processing? That sounds like it's all about seeing the bigger picture, right?
Precisely. Relational processing is where you focus on the connections and the relationships between different pieces of information. It's about understanding how things fit together, why they relate to each other, and the overall structure.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, the paper uses a really memorable example to illustrate these two types of processing.
Okay.
It's about an old man and a bowl of soup. Can you walk us through that so we can really see the difference?
Absolutely. It's a good one. Imagine a fairy tale where there's this old man so frail that his eyesight was poor and his hands trembled constantly. When he tried to eat, his hands shook so badly he could barely hold the spoon, and he kept spilling soup on the tablecloth. Now, if you're using relational processing here, you'd be focusing on the connection between the old man's frailty, the poor eyesight, the shaky hands, and the inevitable result, him spilling the soup.
Oh, okay.
You're seeing the cause and effect at play.
Right, you're connecting those dots. The old man's condition led directly to the spilled soup. That's the relationship.
Exactly.
And how would individual item processing come into play if you were trying to remember this part of the story?
With individual item processing, you'd be focusing on the specific details themselves. You'd be thinking about the particular nature of his frailty, the trembling limbs, the dim vision, and the precise detail of the accident. The soup ending up on the tablecloth.
Ah, the specific image.
Yeah, you're concentrating on the individual components of the story.
So both kinds of processing are important for fully remembering the story, but they're different types of mental effort. Yeah. How do different study techniques actually nudge us towards these different kinds of thinking?
Well, certain activities naturally push you towards focusing on those specific details. Things like, say, defining key vocabulary or answering very specific questions about a particular sentence.
Like those embedded questions we mentioned.
Exactly. On the other hand, techniques like summarizing a larger chunk of text or creating a concept map really force you to think about how different ideas connect and the relationships between them. That's relational.
And it seems like the type of material we're reading also has a big influence on which type of processing we naturally lean towards, doesn't it?
Exactly. This is the crucial third piece of the puzzle. Different kinds of materials think about the stark contrast between, say, an engaging fairy tale and a really dense factual report.
Yeah, totally different feel.
They naturally invite different kinds of processing from you, the reader, even before you actively start trying to study.
So a story might pull you into thinking about the sequence of events and why the characters do what they do that feels more like relational processing, maybe.
That's often the case, yeah.
And a list of facts might make you focus on understanding each fact individually, more of that individual item processing.
That's the general idea. And this leads us to the central idea of the paper, the key hypothesis, which is where it gets really interesting for understanding how you can learn better.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's the big takeaway here?
The main idea is that you learn significantly better when your study method encourages a type of thinking that you wouldn't naturally do as much with that specific material.
Oh, interesting. So the opposite, almost.
Kind of. It's about creating a cognitive balance. If your study method just reinforces the way the material already makes you think, you're not really pushing your brain in a new, beneficial way, and the memory boost will be minimal. This is what they call the overlap concept. You want to aim for complementary processing.
Ah, so it's about consciously pushing our brains to work in a slightly different way than the material naturally leads us. That makes a lot of intuitive sense for making sure we really engage with it. Now, did the researchers actually find evidence to support this idea?
Absolutely. They described a really clever experiment where they made texts more difficult in different ways, either by deleting some of the letters
Right.
or by scrambling the order of the sentences. And they looked at how these changes affected how well people remembered two very different types of writing, fairy tales and descriptive passages.
And what did they discover? How did these manipulations impact recall for those different kinds of texts?
The results were quite striking. They found that scrambling the sentences actually helped people remember the descriptive passages better,
Okay.
but it didn't really make much difference for the fairy tales.
Why do you think that was the case? What's the connection there?
Well, the researchers argued that when you have to unscramble sentences to make sense of them, it forces you to actively organize the information.
Makes sense.
This encourages that relational processing. You're working hard to connect the scattered pieces and figure out the logical flow. Descriptive texts, which often present a collection of details or facts without a strong inherent story structure, really benefit from this imposed organization.
That makes perfect sense. You're essentially providing the structure that the text itself might be lacking, which helps you remember the relationships between the ideas. And what about deleting letters? How did that affect recall?
Interestingly, deleting letters had the opposite effect. It consistently improved how well people remembered the fairy tales,
Really?
but it didn't provide any noticeable benefit for the descriptive passages.
What's the thinking behind that? Why would making the words harder to read actually help with remembering a story?
The act of filling in those missing letters requires you to really focus on the individual words and their specific meaning. This pushes you towards that individual item processing. Fairy tales, with their often clear storyline and sequence of events, might already encourage a good amount of relational processing on their own, you know?
Right. The story carries you along.
Exactly. So the letter deletion encourages you to engage more deeply with the specific elements of the story, leading to better memory for those details.
So in both scenarios, making the text harder actually helped learning because it prompted a type of mental work that wasn't the natural way you'd engage with that specific kind of material.
Precisely.
It's like the added challenge was productive because it steered your mental efforts in a helpful direction. That's a key insight. Difficulty can be a powerful learning tool, but only when it forces you to think in a way that the material itself doesn't already encourage.
Exactly. And this led them to summarize this idea with the MAD framework, material appropriate difficulty.
Mandy, I like it.
Yeah. The crucial takeaway here for you as a learner is that difficulty enhances learning specifically when it leads to processing that complements the material's inherent characteristics. Not all difficulty is created equal when it comes to learning effectively.
This has some really interesting implications for the idea of deliberately introducing some critical confusion in education, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Our work suggests that while deliberately introducing some confusion can be helpful as a teaching strategy, it's absolutely crucial that this confusion encourages the right kind of thinking for the specific subject matter you're trying to master.
Right. It needs to be productive confusion.
Exactly. It's not just about making things harder for the sake of it. It's about making them harder in a way that promotes a beneficial type of cognitive processing. Not all confusion is equally beneficial. It needs to be material appropriate to actually help you learn.
That's a really important distinction for anyone trying to help others learn, or even for when you're trying to challenge yourself.
Hmm.
And the paper also touched on just how much you should increase the difficulty, right?
Hmm.
Is it always a case of the harder the better, as long as it's material appropriate?
No, their findings suggest that there might be a sweet spot.
Hmm.
Increasing the difficulty of a task that's appropriate for the material doesn't necessarily lead to continuously better memory, and it can even become counterproductive beyond a certain point.
Right. Diminishing returns.
Exactly. There seems to be an optimal level of what we might call productive struggle.
Yeah.
If you make it too hard, your comprehension might suffer, and that could negate any potential memory benefits you might have gained from the increased processing.
So it's all about finding that right balance, challenging enough to encourage that complementary processing, but not so overwhelming that it just leads to frustration and hinders understanding altogether. Now, what about remembering things over the long haul? Does this framework have any implications for long-term retention for you, the listener?
That's a really important question. The research hints that relational processing might be particularly crucial for remembering information over longer periods.
Okay.
This could be true even for material that naturally encourages relational processing. By actively engaging in relational thinking, making those connections explicit, maybe drawing a map or something, you might be solidifying those neural pathways in your memory, leading to better recall down the line.
Interesting. So even if you're reading a novel that naturally pulls you into thinking about the characters' relationships, actively outlining those connections or summarizing the key plot points could still give your long-term memory a boost.
Potentially, yeah. That's the suggestion.
Now, let's bring this back to practical tools you might use when you're studying. How does this framework apply to common techniques like embedded questions?
Well, if we look at the framework, embedded questions, which, like we said, often focus on specific details within a text,
Yeah.
they seem to primarily encourage that individual item processing. So going back to what we discussed earlier, this research would suggest that these types of questions might be most effective when you're dealing with narrative texts like fairy tales, where focusing on the specifics can really enhance your memory for the story's details.
Okay, that fits with the idea of matching the study technique to the material. What about outlining, which is another really common strategy people use when they're trying to learn something?
Outlining, by its very nature, encourages you to organize information and identify the relationships between different concepts. That's relational processing in action.
Right, you're building a structure.
Exactly. So based on the logic of the framework, the paper suggests that outlining could be particularly beneficial when you're working with less structured, more expository texts, where you're essentially imposing a framework to connect the various pieces of information.
And the study actually put these two techniques to the test, right?
Right.
What did they find when they compared outlining and embedded questions when people were reading fairy tales versus descriptive passages?
Yeah, they did. And the results really strongly supported the whole idea of material appropriate processing. They found that outlining significantly improved how well people remembered the descriptive passages,
Okay.
but it didn't really help with the fairy tales. Conversely, those embedded questions significantly boosted recall for the fairy tales, but didn't make much difference for the descriptive passages. It was a really clear demonstration of how matching your study technique to the material can make a big difference.
That's pretty powerful stuff and really makes you think twice about just blindly using the same study methods for everything.
Yeah.
What about visual aids, like pictures that are often included with text? How do they fit into this whole picture?
Interestingly, the research found that pictures tend to support the type of processing that the text already encourages rather than making up for a lack of it.
Oh, so they supplement, not compensate.
Kind of, yeah. So pictures that showed specific details helped people remember details from descriptive text, and pictures that illustrated relationships between characters or events helped with recalling the relationships in fairy tales.
So it sounds like pictures tend to reinforce the natural way we're already processing the material rather than pushing us to think in a new direction.
That's the implication, yes. It suggests that pictures might be most helpful when they align with how you're already engaging with the material. If a text makes you focus on details, then detailed pictures will enhance that. If it prompts you to think about connections, then pictures that highlight those connections will be most effective.
That's a subtle but really important distinction for anyone creating learning materials or even just trying to understand how to use them effectively. Now, let's think about you, the learner. How does your existing knowledge about a topic influence this whole idea of material-appropriate processing?
That's a crucial factor to consider. How much you already know about a subject can significantly impact how you process new information related to it, and therefore which study strategies will ultimately be the most effective for you.
The paper mentions an experiment using a passage about baseball. Can you tell us about that and what they found?
Yes, they had people read a passage describing a baseball game. And crucially, they had some participants who knew a lot about baseball and others who knew very little.
Experts versus novices.
Exactly. Then, they presented the text in a few different ways. The original version, one with some letters missing, and one with the sentences all jumbled up.
And what did they observe in terms of how well people remember the passage based on their baseball knowledge and how the text was presented?
It was really interesting for those who didn't know much about baseball. Scrambling the sentences, which, as we discussed, encourages you to actively piece things together and see the relationships between events.
Right. Forces relational processing.
That was actually more helpful for remembering the game. However, for those who were already baseball experts, having letters deleted from the words, which pushes you to focus on the specific terms and actions, the individual items, that showed more of a benefit.
That's really fascinating. It suggests that if you already have a good understanding of how things generally work in a domain, then a study technique that makes you focus on the nitty-gritty details might be more beneficial.
That seems so.
Your existing knowledge might already provide that relational framework.
Exactly. If you already have a solid mental model of how things fit together in a subject, then doing extra work on the relationships might be less necessary. What you really need is to solidify the specific facts and events within that existing framework.
The paper also touches on a more nuanced understanding based on how clear the cause and effect relationships are within a text itself.
Yeah.
How's that factor into this?
Yeah, that's a refinement. More recent thinking in this area suggests that how well a piece of writing establishes clear cause and effect links might be a key factor in whether it naturally invites relational processing.
Okay.
Fairy tales, for example, often have very strong causal chains of events. This happened, so this happened next.
Right. Very linear, usually.
On the other hand, a description of a baseball game, even if you know a lot about baseball, might not have those same inherent causal links between all the specific plays. It might be more like a sequence of distinct events.
Yeah, I can see that.
This could explain why relational processing, like unscrambling the sentences, could still be helpful even for knowledgeable readers in that context. They still need to build some of those connections.
So it's not just about the general topic, but also about how the information is presented and whether those underlying connections are obvious or need to be actively constructed.
Precisely. And this leads us to some of the questions that the original researchers themselves acknowledged still needed further investigation.
What are some of those remaining questions that they felt were important to explore?
Well, they specifically mentioned that more research was needed to see how this idea of material-appropriate processing applies to different kinds of tests, not just the free recall they used in their experiments.
That's multiple choice.
For instance, do these same principles hold true if you're taking a multiple-choice exam or writing an essay? Big questions. They also noted that their initial research focused mainly on relatively short pieces of text.
Right.
And it would be valuable to understand how this framework operates when you're dealing with much longer and more complex materials, like entire chapters of a textbook or, a whole research paper.
Those are really important questions, especially for educators and for all of us who are constantly learning. It's clear that while this framework is incredibly insightful, there's still more to learn about how we learn best.
Absolutely. But even with what we understand now, the framework of material-appropriate processing offers some incredibly valuable insights that you can start applying right away to your own learning.
Okay, let's wrap things up for our listener with the key takeaway from this deep dive into material-appropriate processing.
The fundamental message is this. The secret to more effective learning isn't just about grinding harder, but about being smarter about how you approach the material. Take a moment to really think about the nature of what you're trying to learn. Is it primarily about memorizing specific details, or is it about understanding the connections and relationships between different ideas? Then, consciously choose study strategies that will push you to engage with that material in a way that complements its natural structure.
So some really practical advice for you, our listener. The next time you're faced with something new to learn, resist the urge to just jump into whatever study method you usually use.
Yeah, pause for a sec.
Instead, take a moment to analyze the material itself. Are you diving into a narrative with a clear sequence of events, or are you tackling a set of interconnected facts and concepts?
Exactly. And then make a deliberate choice to use study techniques that will encourage you to interact with the material in a way that might feel a little different from your initial inclination.
Okay, give us an example.
Well, for example, if you're reading a dense factual article, make a conscious effort to look for the underlying connections and maybe try creating an outline or a concept map. Force that relational thinking. If you're engrossed in a story, maybe pay closer attention to specific details. Try to visualize the scenes in your mind, or even jot down notes about individual characters and their motivations. Push that individual item focus.
That's really actionable advice that we can all put into practice immediately. It's about being more strategic and thoughtful about our learning process. Finally, what's a lingering thought that this deep dive leaves us with? Something for our listener to continue to ponder.
Well, consider how this idea of material appropriate processing might have implications far beyond just studying for tests or learning new skills.
Oh, interesting. Like where?
Could it influence how we communicate complex information to others, how we design more effective presentations, or even how we approach problem solving in different areas of our lives? The way information is structured and the way we engage with it seems to have really profound implications across many different contexts.
That's a fascinating point to consider. It really makes you wonder about how the appropriateness of our engagement can make all the difference in understanding and remembering, not just in formal learning situations.
Absolutely. And we've really only touched the surface of this fascinating area of research. The original paper by McDaniel and Einstein is packed with even more insights and raises a lot of other intriguing questions about the science of learning.
So maybe worth digging into.
Definitely. We highly encourage you to seek it out and delve even deeper into this powerful framework. And maybe think, what other examples can you think of where the appropriateness of the processing truly makes all the difference in how well you understand and remember something? That's your food for thought after this deep dive. Thanks for exploring this with us.